Evening, everyone, and welcome to this special Voices of Goldstein event, The Climate Bill, What's Next, with special guest Zali Steggall MP. I'm Jo Stanley, and it's my great pleasure to be your host and moderator this evening. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land I'm broadcasting to you from, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and extend that acknowledgement to the owners of the lands and waterways this broadcast reaches. We pay our respect to elders past and present, as well as to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are tuning in tonight. Well, it is wonderful to have you all joining us, me in my house, you in yours, whether you're in your pajamas from the waist down, or perhaps you've set yourself up in your laundry because that's where the greatest, strongest internet is. Maybe you're relaxing with a glass of wine or a cuppa, or maybe you've just felt safe to go back into your house after the great Melbourne earthquake of this morning. I mean, is there anything else that this year can throw at us? But tonight is an opportunity to learn more about why Australia doesn't have a net zero emissions target and how independence can help accelerate climate action in Australia. Like many of you, I'm concerned about climate change, about our government's apparent lack of action, and I'm curious to know what a climate act would look like and what difference it would make to Australia's climate response. We do welcome your questions throughout the event. If you could just pop your questions in the chat, and those questions will be shared with me to present to Zali, and we'll try to get through as many of those as we possibly can. Also, while we're on housekeeping, we would appreciate it if you could make sure you're on mute. And we should also mention that you can choose to turn your cameras off, but we have elected to see your faces. We'd love to see all of the people in this particular event, but just letting you know to be aware that if your camera is on, not to share too much more than your faces, just to be aware of that. So I was really pleased to be asked to host this event by Voices of Goldstein because I'm passionate about democratic discussion, and I wish to see members of parliament that better reflect the communities that I belong to. But I should be clear that I have no political affiliation. I'm just a citizen of Goldstein who wants a better outcome for our country and our people, and a more optimistic future for our kids than what I'm currently seeing. But let me introduce you to a representative of Voices of Goldstein to speak more about their work, Katerina Gator. Hi there, Kat.
Hi, Jo. Thanks so much for doing this, and thank you, Zali, for coming along as well. We're thrilled, and we've had a record registrations tonight, so very exciting. Thank you. Yes, did you? I'll tell you a little bit about Voices, I guess. We're part of a growing movement of people concerned with, I guess, like you, like the way in which our democracy is going, particularly vested interests and party politics that are affecting the decisions that our elected representatives are making and the way that they behave. And we're seeing that's having really very real consequences for our society and our world, and I guess particularly for a lot of us with regard to issues such as climate change. There are actually 30 or more than 30 voices groups around the country. We're all independent of one another, but we're motivated by similar concerns and inspired by grassroots movements in electorates like Indi and Warringah, which ultimately led to the election of independents like Zali. And in fact, we did an event in July with Kath McGowan, who was part of that original movement, and it was just so refreshing and inspiring to see. We did it with Kath McGowan and constituents from her electorate and Zali's electorate, and it was so inspiring and refreshing to see people actually speak positively about their representative and their democracy. And I guess it was a real reminder for us that that's actually what democracy should be and can be. And that's what we're trying to make it, an empowering experience where we feel listened to and that we trust our representatives and we feel they're genuinely transparent and accountable. So that's what Voices is really about. And I guess we've gone through a process in the last few months where we've decided the best way to do that. And following in the footsteps of Indi and Warringah, we decided to launch a campaign looking for an independent candidate who could represent us in that way. So that's our focus at the moment. Is to find someone that is of equal calibre and integrity and can win an election to represent Goldstein.
So how can people be involved and support Voices of Goldstein?
Thanks for asking. We we are getting closer to an election. In fact, it's possible that we could have one by the end of the year. So we actually really need everyone to step up and do as much as possible. If you believe, if you're watching and you believe that the current state of play is not good enough, then please step up and get involved. There are 3 key things that we're focusing on at the moment. The first is finding the right candidate. We do have a number of people who have stepped forward, and we're going through the process of talking to them and interviewing them. And we may have a candidate very soon, but we want to make sure that we've left no stone unturned in our search. So if you think you know anybody, or if you're interested yourself, there is still time to put forward your own name or put forward someone else. And I think Henry's just put a link in the chat right now to the page on our website where you can do that. The second thing is that we need to build our tribe. I'm sure Zali can speak to this. It was a really key part of the Warringah campaign. And my understanding is, you know, it was because both Zali and Kath McGowan saw the momentum in the community and the real desire for change that they stepped forward in the first place and had the confidence to make the sacrifice to you know, commit to a campaign and then ultimately representation. Because of the groundswell. So we're really working on building that groundswell. I know that in Warringah, it all started with T-shirts. People bought T-shirts that said, "Time's up, Tony." They wore them out and about. People saw that. They had conversations. They thought, oh, maybe I'll do that too. They bought a T-shirt, more conversations, more T-shirts, more conversations. And it was just that alone, they built a movement of 20,000 people. They started in September, and by January, they had 20,000 people. So we would love to replicate that there. We have our T-shirts, and I think Henry's put a link to where you can buy them as well. Please buy a T-shirt, go out and wear it when you do your shopping, when you do your exercise. We are in lockdown, but we can still be walking billboards and have conversations with people about why we want better representation. And then finally, the third and probably the most significant thing that we're asking of people tonight, we know that you probably all know that the major parties spend really big money on winning elections. Sadly, that means that even if we have the most amazing independent candidate, we're not going to be able to, well, they're not going to be able to win in Goldstein without significant funds to match that spending of the big parties. And we know a lot of money will come once that candidate actually publicly launches, but it's a bit of a catch-22 because even to have a winning campaign, you have to launch really well, and you have to, you know, to bring in those funds, you have to launch really well. So at the moment, we're actually just starting today a pledge campaign to try and build the funds that we need for a really good launch. And again, Henry's putting the link in the chat. It's a pledge campaign, not a donation. So we're asking people to pledge money that they would put forward to support a candidate even when we get the right person. So there's no money up front, it's all a promise, and then we'd call on you afterwards to commit that money. And it would go towards things like setting up the website, getting a big advertising campaign going, employing some campaign staff to get going even before the launch. And our goal is actually to raise a minimum of $120,000 in pledges by the 8th of October. And that's only 2 weeks ago. And I know that sounds really huge, but the good news is that although we're launching this publicly tonight, we actually did a really soft launch of this with about 60 members a couple of weeks ago. And already in such a short time, we've got $87,000 in pledges. So it's amazing. Not that far to go to that 120,000. The average amount so far was about 1,500 that people have donated. And if we could average something like that again tonight, then we'd smash that goal straight away. Obviously, that's, you know, not everyone can afford that. That was an average. Some gave less, some gave more. But I guess the one thing we want everyone to think about, and we ask you to consider, is, you know, what democracy really means to you, and how much you want to give both in time and in money to really make that a strong democracy, because it's too important to leave it to a lot of the politicians we have at the moment. So yeah, those are the 3 things, and the links are in the chat.
Thank you so much, Kat, and congratulations. That's a considerable amount that you've raised already in such a short amount of time. So that's fantastic. And of course, you do need more. So consider pledging if you're able to. And I want to acknowledge Carolyn's comment in chat there. Wear the T-shirt at Sandy Farmers Market this Saturday. And as a resident in Goldstein, I can tell you that just talk about it when you're going to get your coffee, because gee whiz, we love a coffee and we stand on street corners and we with our mask, of course, but spread the word. I think it's really, really powerful. So thank you so much, Kat, and thank you to the Voices of Goldstein for the work that you're doing. All righty, now to our guest for this evening. Zali Steggall OAM is the independent federal member for the seat of Warringah in Sydney's north. She's also Australia's most successful alpine skier, so perhaps it's no accident that someone who loves the snowfields is aware of climate change. From 2008, Zali was a practicing barrister, but in 2019, Zali contested the federal parliamentary seat of Warringah as an independent candidate. The seat had been held for nearly 25 years by former Prime Minister Tony Abbott, and as we all know, she did win that seat. Zali, hello. It's so great to have you join us this evening.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Hi, everyone.
Well, let's dive right into the climate change bill. You introduced your climate change bill in November 2020. Can you tell us about the bill? How does it work?
Yeah, look, obviously, when I decided to stand at the 2019 election, it was, I think, probably like many people here tonight, incredibly frustrated at our lack of policy around climate change, and actually the fact that we were going backwards. The rest of the world was moving on, and we really just could not get out of gear from the partisan politics, the political football that climate change policy had become. Because obviously the previous member for Warringah had a pretty big part to play in that as well. So a big goal for me once elected was to actually put forward a sensible plan. So I asked my team of advisors, we looked around the world, we looked at other countries, we looked at who's been able to get bipartisan support for good climate policy, and the UK really stood out. So back in 2008, the UK managed to pass the Climate Change Act with bipartisan support, and that legislation has survived over, you've got to think all the Brexit and all the changes of prime ministers they've had, and is an incredibly strong structure in how they've managed to develop their policy and achieve really strong emission reduction goals. So we modelled the climate change bills on the UK's Act that was... It's a framework legislation. So what it does is it sets into law our ultimate goal, which is we need to reach net zero by no later than 2050. So it puts a line in the sand. And I know a lot of people, obviously with the science, we need to be sooner than that, but we at the very least minimum need to draw that line in the sand, that it, a hard and fast rule. It can be brought forward, so in the provisions of the bill. But the structure of the bill was really important, trying to focus on a little bit more expert advice around how are we tracking, what plans are actually working, how much emission reduction do we need to do, and how do we do it just equitably and with good planning. We need to do it fiscally responsibly, but we need to make sure all the regions are properly taken care of and all the industries and sectors. So the bill sets in place 5-year emission reduction budgets, and 5 years is incredibly important because it means that you're taking it out of the 3-year election cycles that the federal politics does. So it means you're having to lock in at any one time 2 5-year emission reduction budgets. And that gives the private sector really good visibility on where government policy is going. And it takes away the sting of every 3 years a political campaign for a federal election where both major parties try and wedge each other on who's going to have the least worst policy. How can we make this a vote-winning issue in a coal seat in Queensland versus a seat in Sydney, So really important to have that planning. And then it's actually, climate change is also about our risk assessment, and we're really underprepared in Australia, or even though we're a continent that's going to be incredibly exposed. The Bureau of Meteorology has actually calculated that we are currently on track for 4.3 degrees of warming by the end of the century in Australia. Now, that is really scary. That is not good news for Australia. We'll have whole parts of Australia uninhabitable. So We desperately need a risk assessment that is done nationally, coordinated, and then adaptation plans be prepared to respond to those risk assessments. So that's what the bill does. The bill is really structured into very clear sections around the guiding principles for decision makers, and that's still always the government. An ultimate goal of the net zero with the 5-year budgets, the risk assessment, and then the adaptation plans. And finally, it does have the establishment of a climate change commission. And that's been incredibly important and effective in the UK in taking the politics out of this policy area, in the sense that once you have advice to government on the best science and the best modelling on how to do it, and we've all seen how that's been taken up around our COVID response, it's all been modelled and based on health expert advice and the Doherty Institute, modelling, and that has been the foundation and basis for the policies the governments have, state governments and federal governments have rolled out. So I think it's incredibly important for climate change policy that we have a strong climate change commission. And unfortunately, at the moment, that we don't have that expert voice to government.
So does your bill differ greatly from other proposals in the past?
We haven't had this kind of proposal in Australia. So, oops, don't know what happened there. Sorry.
I see.
My iPad has a mind of its own sometimes.
Sure.
No. So if you go back to when the climate debate, if you think back to the 2007 election, we actually that was the last time we had bipartisan agreement in Australia on climate policy. Kevin Rudd, John Howard both went to the election with a commitment around emissions reductions. At the time, so in the UK, for example, they had the campaign had started around their climate change bill, and they took the route of going for that kind of framework legislation, that's sort of the overarching legislation that locks in a commitment, and then the policy gets developed underneath it. In Australia, we went around it the other way. So the Gillard minority government put in the carbon trading scheme, but unfortunately that was kind of, you're putting in the mechanism before you've locked in the ultimate ambition. And of course that became a political football and was wound back by the next government. What we really, I think it would have been better, instead of debating the how, let's all agree on the what. What is it that we need to commit to? So that then it's a little bit, if you think about education or national security or our defence forces, we all agree we need those. We all agree we need to have a strong policy around it. Sure, different sides of politics have a different approach to it, but ultimately we don't debate the fact that we need to have them. And unfortunately, with climate policy, we still haven't got a cohesive approach in Parliament where both sides of politics, and my blame is squarely on the Nationals here and the coalition, we do not have a bipartisan approach on the urgency or the necessity to have a clear policy around climate change.
So I do know that your bill received a great deal of support outside of politics, across all different industries. Who supported you and why?
Yeah, look, it was obviously, I did a lot of consultation because as an independent, I am one voice, I represent Warringah, but it was really important for me to put forward a solution that was viewed as a sensible, that it's something that all sectors could get behind, that it provided that kind of solution to this problem that everyone could move forward with. So the environmental groups could move forward with it, the business industry, so the Business Council of Australia strongly supported it, the Australian Industry Group supported it, Superannuation, APRA, Local Government Association, all our major cities. Ironically, it reflects the policy of all of our state government and territory governments because they are all committed to net zero by 2050. And so it really had broad appeal and broad support. Ironically, the only two that held out in their support were National Farmers Association, which, although they've committed to net zero by 2050, I think it was political that they didn't want to upset the apple cart with the Nationals by being seen as supporting the climate change bill, and the Minerals Council, which, probably not surprising. But so really they were the only sectors that held out. and ironically, the coalition, the Liberal and National MPs. What I think my view is they have very much held out purely for political reasons, not for good policy or any genuine reason that there is anything wrong with the legislation or the model. It's purely because, A, I don't think they have a desire to truly fix this policy area and genuinely put in place a solution. And B, they certainly would not want to acknowledge that the solution could be put forward by anyone, other than them.
Sure. It also received, it had evidence from across industry, science and health. So it was very robust, and yet all that evidence was ignored by the parliamentary committee. So was there an explanation as to why?
Oh, there was, but it was pretty weak. Look, it was really important to have that inquiry because I've felt, probably like many here, incredibly frustrated that we only have a debate about what is good climate policy every 3 years when there's an election. And unfortunately, then you are looking at climate policies of candidates in each seat against a backdrop of a lot of other policies. And that can often get distorted by the media and swayed, it gets lost in the discussion. And so I felt it was really important in the time between elections that we have a very clear discussion about what would good law and good policy around climate look like, and give the communities an opportunity to have a voice. So, over 6,500 people made submissions, which is huge. The only other inquiry, I believe, that's had more has been around same-sex marriage, but also to give businesses a voice. So all the industry groups made submissions, major corporates, of course, BCA, ARG. The Australian Medical Association has since come out really strongly. So they came out during the inquiry. So we really, veterinarian, can't pronounce it, but the vets came out really strong. So the whole industry's got the opportunity to participate. And I thought that was really important because the Prime Minister has said in question time, I've asked him, I've said, when are we going to have proper policy on climate change in Australia? And he has, with bravado told me that, well, we're not going to let the international community dictate what our climate commitment should be. I will be listening to Australia. We'll be setting Australian policy in Australia. So I thought, right, if we're going to set that policy in Australia, let's listen to Australia. And that's why the inquiry was really important. But of course, when we came down to it, the coalition members on the committee just played politics. They do not genuinely engage with the seriousness of this issue, and they ignored the evidence and all the pleas from business that this actually would really help them moving forward. That even union, I had the ACTU, I had the electrical trade union, so we had the unions and BCA and industry all agreeing that they needed this framework and this visibility to properly plan ahead.
So where does it sit now as far as the parliamentary process, and where is the bill now?
Look, one of the great things that came out of the inquiry was a number of recommendations for amendments. And so we've taken a lot of those on board. So very important for me that it's a consultative process. So we are going to, we've made some of the amendments, like the plans from the minister should be disallowable instruments. We've tightened up some of the duties around how the plans and the responding to the expert advice should be. And we'll be introducing an interim target. So the second 5-year budget, which will be 2031, will be introducing an interim budget. But I'll be reintroducing the bill on the 18th of October, fingers crossed, assuming we can be in Parliament with all the lockdowns. And really putting the pressure on the government that as we head into COP26, the government has no plan, no commitment. We are absolute pariahs on the international scene. That here is a solution. This is a widely supported solution. It has been workshopped. It has been, it's been consultative. That if the Prime Minister wants to take something to COP26 that Australia can be proud of, this actually is it. So I want it to be on the notice paper, presented again in Parliament. I will try and push it to a vote, but that is incredibly difficult at the moment because of lockdowns. We don't have a full quorum of basically we don't have a lot of MPs sitting in the chamber, so that makes things more difficult. But look, we know we are 4 to 6 months away from an election, and I think it's incredibly important that all communities really make climate policy their number one issue when they vote, because this is crucial. We are in the decade where we must implement strong policy. We cannot wait. And it really is important that the climate bill be on the table. And so the coalition and Liberal MPs have that, their communities squarely aware that this solution is there. And if they're going to talk a big game about being committed to climate action and net zero by 2050, but then refuse to support the solution that everyone is behind, then they are not genuine in their commitment.
Yeah. Some of the criticism of the bill, and one of the people who has used this particular criticism is our MP, Tim Wilson, is that the bill is just politics. This is what he has written in an opinion piece, and that it's unnecessary and a subversion of our democracy and sovereignty. What's your reaction to that?
Oh, that's absolute rubbish. And ironically, other participants to the inquiry pointed out that criticism was rubbish. That's not even just my words. Look, in terms of that it's not needed, well, obviously BCA, AIG and everybody that makes submissions disagree. Every sector in Australia overwhelmingly wants us to lock in a commitment and also lock in clear risk assessment and adaptation planning. We have whole communities that are left completely unprotected at the moment, because we have to be realistic. A government that underplays and minimises the risk because they don't really want to have to take the commensurate action needed means you are leaving communities unprepared and unsafe, and that is not acceptable. So my first point would be, I beg to disagree that it is absolutely needed. The other aspect of, look, and Tim Wilson's comments are, they've been trotted out by pretty much every Liberal MP about this idea that it's usurping the role of government to have an expert-based climate change commission. So the bill is really clear. The power around the establishing the budgets and the adaptation plans are purely in the government's hands. So no one is usurping any power from elected government. It is the minister who has the power to do that. The thing the bill requires, that the minister, if the government of the day chooses to depart from the expert evidence and the expert advice of a climate change commission, which is public, then it has to explain why. So you have to explain why you are departing from that expert advice. So if I could think of, what's happening at the moment with COVID, where we are told every decision made by premiers and the Prime Minister is on expert advice. The expert health advice is directing this. So why can't we have the same approach that our response to the biggest health risk we have, which is global warming, should be done on the basis of expert advice? I think it's an absolutely empty argument. And I think it's a bit hypocritical, because we would all remember that when COVID started, the government and the coalition and Prime Minister Morrison was very quick to establish the COVID Coordination Commission, which was advising government on how we should manage our response to COVID and our supply lines. And they were quite happy to stack that with executives. So when a commission suits their purpose, they're happy to have it. When it's an independent expert commission, not so happy.
What about the suggestion that the Climate Change Commission isn't needed because they already have the Climate Change Authority and the Clean Energy Regulator?
Yeah, unfortunately, the Climate Change Authority was established under the legislation passed by the Gillard government, and it has since pretty much been gutted, and it's been stacked with gas and fossil fuel mining industry officials, executives. So it really is not playing the part that it really should have. And actually, during the inquiry, I asked the Climate Change Authority if it had advised government, or if the government had asked it to provide advice in relation to what our emission reduction ambition should be. And they said no, they haven't been asked, and they haven't provided formal advice to government since 2015. So that's telling you something about how efficient the Climate Change Authority is. And in the inquiry, I asked the officials from the Department of Energy, so under Angus Taylor, if they had modelled a pathway to net zero. And if it's not 2050, then when is it? And what is that modelling? And they pretty much conceded that they haven't done the work, and they haven't been asked by the government to do the work to get to net zero. Now, I asked the Climate Change Authority, they said the same thing. They have not been asked by the government to model a pathway to net zero. And when I asked the Department of Environment, so under Susan Lee, have you modelled the risk the risk assessment for us nationally if we don't change course and we stay on this track of, considerable warming? What is the risk assessment across the nation and industries? And they acknowledge they haven't done the risk assessment. So we're flying blind. We're not doing the modelling, and we're not even calculating the risk of what we're exposed to. And I think that's completely unacceptable.
So why, more than 100 countries around the world have set net zero emissions targets. Why is the Morrison government refusing to do this?
Political gamemanship, I would say, mainly because the coalition government there is a secret deal between the Nationals and the Liberals. No one knows what the terms of that deal are. And right now, for any kind of climate policy, the Liberals have to negotiate with Barnaby Joyce. Now, Barnaby Joyce, he is hand in hand with Matt Canavan when it comes to loving coal. So that is the big why we do not have proper climate policy. And that's why, with all respect to members like Tim Wilson, they talk a big game on climate, but they never stand up for those issues and those beliefs in Parliament. I've seen Barnaby Joyce threaten to cross the floor to get his way over the coalition. I have never seen any Liberal MP threaten to cross the floor on anything to do with climate, to do with reducing funding of fossil fuels around gas or coal, whether it's, any kind of, and I've introduced a number of amendments and they never do. So why don't we have better climate policy? Well, because at the moment the people in government are not genuinely committed to putting in place strong climate policy.
Well, I'll get to some questions from our audience because there's some fantastic ones there. The first being, does COP26 give you an opportunity to get more support for this bill from other members of Parliament and from the broader community?
Yes, because obviously COP26 puts climate back in the forefront of the conversation. I mean, we've obviously had a very strange 2 years with COVID and we have a lot of challenges. But the big difference is other countries have used the challenge of COVID and the recovery, the need to recover and rebuild their economies. They've used that impetus to put in place some really green policies, some policies that will accelerate a transition to a net zero world. And unfortunately, we haven't done any of that. Our last two budgets have still been 80-1 funding of fossil fuels versus renewables. None of the programs around the recovery were geared towards efficiencies or emissions reductions. So that's really disappointing. So COP26 is incredibly important. We have the Prime Minister overseas at the moment. He is obviously trying to, look good for allies. The international community knows that we are not doing enough. They are putting a lot of pressure on us, but it's really important that there is pressure domestically as well, because if not, it has to come. It has to come from every sector. I strongly believe the coalition will only move on climate when it knows that votes are in it for them. And so that if they are going to lose votes over it, then all of a sudden you will see policy start to emerge. And we're seeing that already with COP26. There's a lot of spin coming out, but I think Australians need to be savvy and know that spin is not going to cut it on this issue, not in this decade. We need absolute plans, and I would argue the first step to show you are genuine in your commitment is to agree to debate the climate change bills in Parliament. Labor have agreed to, have indicated that they support a debate on the bills. The Greens, the crossbench have as well. I only need 3 MPs from the coalition to cross the floor, and we have a debate.
You talk about spin, and I learned from you just before this conversation that there's a new website that's been launched by the government, positiveenergy.gov.au, which is speaking a lot of optimism and plans, and with not really much anything solid there. Can you tell us about that website?
Yeah, it was released only about last week, kind of undercover by Angus Taylor. And it's public money again, putting use to spin. There's nothing new there. And in fact, it's actually trying to take credit for some policy in some areas where emissions are being reduced and developed, and new technologies that actually aren't they're not actually done by the federal government. They're often initiatives that states and private sector have really been driving. So yes, it's a usual spin, big announcement, but not much behind it. So it's look, to me, unfortunately, what this says is there is still no genuine desire to engage with this issue. I think, for me, this is a decade where we need real leaders. We need people who are, you may have made a mistake in the past. I would say that to the Prime Minister, having taken his lump of coal into Parliament. But in this decade, with the challenges we face, there, a strong leader, there is opportunity to pivot, a much too used word, but the science is is just so certain. We know where we're heading. The recent IPCC report has made it very clear. The markets are making it very clear. The private sector are making it very clear. The financial opportunities are making it very clear. And the environmental imperative is really clear. So if you're not capable of stepping up to the challenge now, I would argue just simply not capable. You cannot be trusted to take on the challenge seriously.
This particular question comes with some stats and a little bit of a preamble, which I have enjoyed reading.
It looks like I need to look at it.
Despite a laggard federal government, it seems as if the market is speaking for itself. 1/3 of all assets under management are invested under an ESG mandate. 70% of world GDP is committed to a net zero target. Climate tech is the fastest growing asset class, and environmental investment in general is seeing record capital inflows. And on top of this, we've seen state governments who are working to their own net zero targets. So the question is, do you think ScoMo even matters here? The transition is happening anyway. How could a federal net zero target help aside from international reputational damage mitigation, which frankly, that is a big concern for me personally. But yes, there's the question, do you think even what the government chooses to do matters?
It does. Unfortunately, it would be easier if it didn't, but it does. From an international point of view, with trading partners, we face a very real risk of international carbon border tariffs, where essentially, because our exports will be considered to have a high carbon footprint, they will be taxed when they are imported into other markets. And it means that we won't have any benefit from it. It will be other markets who will be collecting that revenue. So that's not a good news story for Australian exports. But more importantly, it's the impact on investment confidence. So the government is very fond, I would say, the Prime Minister is very fond of saying technology, not taxes. But reality is, and anyone in industry will tell you, technology needs targets to drive investment and drive uptake. It needs that policy certainty. When industries and large funds, for example, are making investment decisions that are for the next 20, 30 years, they need to pick a market where they feel they're going to be able to give that long-term return. They have some policy stability and certainty that they can count on. They cannot do that in our current federal environment with a government that is actually interfering in the market. So what we're having is large-scale renewables looking at investing huge amounts in battery storage and other solutions. And at the same time, we have a federal government interfering by coming in and funding more gas peakers, for example, and that disrupts market confidence and is really negative. In the last budget, and in the last few months in Parliament, we've had time and time again where the federal government is using a number of legislations to continue funding fossil fuels. So we had the Northern Territory infrastructure legislation, we had the Export Finance Australia legislation, and all have been used to continue funding fossil fuels, in fracking for gas in the Beetaloo Basin. Now, the International Energy Agency has made it very clear we cannot have any new oil, gas or coal fields. It has to stop. It has to stay in the ground. And the Morrison's response, and Tim Wilson voted for this, was to go and open up fracking gas in the Beetaloo Basin. So, you know, you just have to wonder, it is just nonsensical and it's ignoring all the evidence. So unfortunately, yes, states and private sector are going ahead, but without policy certainty into the future and without the kind of legislation like the climate bills that ensures government doesn't, you know, put the handbrake on what the private sector can do, it unfortunately does matter.
Another really great question from our audience. Do you think the recent Murdoch press change of editorial policy with respect to climate change may change the political dynamics and help get your climate bill up?
Look, I'm a bit cynical on that one. I think that's
me too.
I will believe it when I see that Murdoch press come out and do headlines that demand a strong 2030 target of no less than 50%. If they can do that, then I'll believe that they've seen the light and they understand that we need to act on climate. Until they do that, I think it's greenwashing. They're losing money because of advertisers abandoning their publications because of that, you know, the perception in the public that they are simply not working for the public good at all. And look, we hear that, you know, I'm sure the Prime Minister is having his meetings with News Limited right now while he's in the US. It is, look, I think everyone has a responsibility on this issue. Global warming and the impacts that will come will not discriminate. They will impact everyone. No one will be somehow magically protected from the impacts. We saw that with the 2019 bushfires, whole communities having to be evacuated, our cities blanketed in smoke. So this is going to impact everyone, and I think all the journalists that work in News Limited have a duty as well to call this out, and I think that's going to be an interesting development if they fail to, and they certainly still have a lot of fossils in their industry, in their organisation, and they have voices that have been allowed to go unchecked for way too long.
Another question for you. Will international trade partners use trade, such as embargoes and tariffs, as a tool for change? And is this a risk for our exporters if we don't get better climate policy?
Yeah, look, I probably touched that on before. I think there is a real risk of carbon border tariffs. Look, we've seen the announcements around the UK trade agreement, and the UK caved to Australians' demands that there be no reference to temperature goals of the Paris Agreement in there. I think that's going to be very difficult to uphold back in the UK towards UK producers who are all committed to net zero by 2050. They have much higher ambition than Australia in terms of even our interim goals. They're at 68% reductions by 2030. So that gives you an idea of we're travelling on about 22. So it is vastly different. So yes, I think there will be. I mean, the EU trade agreements has hit a bit of a snag with the submarine announcement. So it will be interesting to see what happens there. But the EU are committed to net zero by 2050 as well. So 70% of the world's economies, all our major trading partners are committed to net zero. So by 2050. So this is happening, whether Australia likes it or not. The world is shifting to net zero. The question is, are we going to be left behind, or are we going to be active in this transition and part of the new economies that will emerge?
Well, there's no doubt, we all know that it's critical that we put pressure on our government to provide a net zero policy. And this is why we're all here. And it's why many of us are supporting Voices of Goldstein. And so we'd like to ask a few questions around actually Voices of Goldstein campaign and how do you get an independent elected, essentially. So the first question that we would ask is, what are the 3 key ingredients for an electorate going independent?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of misunderstanding by the opposition, by Liberals and the major parties on how this is effective. The number one ingredient is community engagement. You can't, this is not a top-down situation where you parachute in some candidate. It has to be mobilised on the ground. One of the things that was amazing in Warringah was just, I had 1,400 volunteers. They were all local, you know, vast majority local. We had people prepared to wear their turquoise T-shirts when they went shopping, when they went running, when they went to the gym, walking the dog, you know, in the park. And it meant that people were talking to their neighbours about politics, about what the issues they were worried about. It was absolutely local. So number one, you've got to build your tribe. You have to be a strong community. If your community wants this, then they have to make it happen. You have to have that. You do then, number two is you do need a structure. I always make the analogy that as an ex-professional athlete, I strongly believe that, you know, if you go back to the era where people used to think of, you know, sport was to be at the Olympics, it was amateur sport versus professional sport. I think, you know, this is business. Running a campaign is like running a business. It has to be professional, it has to be well-resourced, and it has to be strategic. And, you know, it is a full-time job to run a good campaign and to beat an incumbent especially. There is a huge advantage in the system for the incumbent. And so to disrupt that, you're going to need that much harder, that much more work. So build the tribe and have a good professional organisation. And then I believe the third will come, you know, build it and they will come. The third will be your candidate. I have to be, you know, for me, it was because I could see the electorate of Warringah was incredibly activated and wanted an alternative choice. And I could see that I would be well resourced and well supported, that I could give it 110% as well and make that leap of faith to do it, because it is a big call. But I have to say, politics is fun. I've enjoyed it. I think politics has gotten a bad rap from the parties because there's so much backstabbing that goes on and all the pre-selection fights and all of that. As an independent, you don't have any of that. You're literally there for the community. I feel like I'm part of the team. I have so much support. So I think that makes a huge difference. So my call is to, if you have professionals in your community who have gotten to a certain point of success in their chosen field, but feel like they would like to give back to their community. Because we have to remember, politics used to be about giving back to your community. It was not a political ambition. It wasn't a career path that you wanted to get to a more powerful position. It was about representing your community and giving back. And so for professionals out there that feel that they are at a time in their career, they feel passionate about the issues, that they can give back to their community by being a voice for their community, then I would urge people to consider it. It's incredibly rewarding. It's an amazing privilege to be in Parliament on behalf of your community.
And what are the key competencies do you think someone needs to be a candidate? And I don't just mean, you know, professional experience or knowledge. I suppose I also mean personally, because we have seen so many stories around the trolling and particularly for women, the experience in Parliament. And, you know, it kind of feels like a really terrifying place to be. So what do you see a person who is the right person will have as their qualities?
Look, I think I've no doubt that independents get scrutinised for their character and their capability a lot more than party candidates. I think party candidates get kind of brought in under a banner, overall marketing umbrella of a party platform, and they don't really have to prove themselves as much as individuals because there's an assumption that it's a party at the end of the day. But I think that's a really negative thing, because it means a community is not really coming to grips with who they're choosing to represent them. So I think independents are held to a higher standard in that way, and that's good. I think because that way you actually are, you know what you're getting, you know who you're trusting with your voice. In terms of the skills, look, I guess I had that. I don't think there is any one formula. I've talked to Helen Haynes about this. She was not of a high profile. She had not been in public life, but obviously she'd had a very successful professional career in her field as a midwife and in nursing. So, and in her academia. So for me, obviously sport gave me the grounding of having to deal with the media and being in the public eye, and being open to criticism. You know, you get criticised a lot. So I was okay with that. Obviously I'm a very competitive person, so I was okay with the high pressure nature of certain situations. And then having been a barrister, obviously the legal side of the work and the advocacy and the debating all came into play. But I would argue I was a political novice. I was not I was very apolitical throughout my professions because I had to be. But I feel strongly about the issues, and I feel I am one of my community. So I don't think there are any one particular skills you need to have. You probably need to be a good communicator. You are going to do a lot of public speaking. That's the one thing I can assure you. You have to do a lot of. But on the whole, you just have to be really dedicated to the issues and be prepared to listen. You're here to listen to your community and represent their views.
This is a question that I've had put to me many times when I've suggested that, you could go down the path of voting for an independent. And that is the issue of a hung parliament and the fact that many people that may not vote for an independent because they don't want this situation to occur and they feel like they need to vote for one of the major parties. Can you speak to how we might respond to that?
It's really interesting. Australia is a very, it's not immature, but it's a really interesting development we've had in Australian politics, this idea that you can only have, the major parties and you have two kind of very clear sides, and that there isn't much diversity, whereas other nations have developed much more diversity around political choice. Because if you think about who we have in Parliament represents our community, and there is a whole broad spectrum of views and opinions and issues in our community, and yet they are not genuinely represented in Parliament because they have until now been falling under these kind of two-sided issues, and you're then at the mercy of how the party room and the people behind the scenes determine those issues. Minority government is a good thing. And it's really interesting how so many people are afraid of minority government. If anything, I would argue minority government is the best thing that can happen to democracy because it forces collaboration. It means that every time government puts up law, it is good law. It's gone through a vigorous process. It has listened to submissions and to input by invested groups, and it has worked with members of Parliament to ensure it represents the best outcome for the vast majority of the Australian people, not just a niche group that has been lucky enough to, lobby government and get their view seen above and beyond maybe what would be best for the whole community. So at the moment, I think we have politics with them when it's a majority government. You have politics where, I don't know if everyone's seen the movie The Big Deal that's come out around the role of money in our politics in Australia. A lot of policy areas are the result of lobbyists and of influence, and money talks. And when it's a majority government, that's what happens. But if it's a minority government, it can't happen that way because you have to collaboratively work around the table. So ironically, I always say to people, if you are, the best way your vote can count is to actually make it a minority government, make your seat marginal, because then you cannot be taken for granted.
I was fortunate enough to interview Cathy McGowan earlier this year, Zali, and she spoke to her time in Parliament as being just the greatest fun. She came alive when she spoke about what she was able to achieve with the other independents in Parliament. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. I think my experience as an independent is very different to the party politicians. They are under constant pressure of pre-selection, of party room intrigues, what faction is with what faction, who's got the power, who's backstabbing who. It is a whole different game. Oh, I don't know why this is happening, but anyway. In comparison, I work with Helen and Rebecca a lot, Rebecca Sharkey and Helen Haynes, Adam Band and Andrew Wilkie as well. We reach out to the crossbench in the Senate. It's a huge privilege to be in Parliament, to have the opportunity to listen to all the groups that have issues that they want you to advocate on their behalf, to go and get briefings with the minister, to talk to the departments about issues, to suggest amendments, to argue for change. You do achieve a lot, even at the moment with a majority government. It's only a majority of one, so the government has to constantly be mindful that it needs to make sure it has support. They have absolutely been willing to work with me. I've passed an amendment to legislation with their support. And you can deliver for your communities in more ways than just votes in Parliament. I think people get very hung up on this, but the amount of work my team has done for my local community in assisting with grants applications, with getting exemptions for travel and visa, and helping people with NDIS and aged care plans, Centrelink, around COVID and vaccination. The amount of help we can do for the community is really, really worthwhile. So you have to think beyond. Remember, it is the parties that will always try and tell you that you don't want a minority government, because that's what, they want to keep the status quo. They're not trying to open this up to being more democratic.
Oh, Zali, thank you so much. You've really inspired me, I must say. And what's exciting is that you're about, you're about to head off. Don't get any ideas, by the way, Kat. I'm not going to be your candidate. I understand, Zali, you're heading off to the launch of North Sydney's independent candidate, Kylie Tink, right about now, actually. And that's exciting. It's exciting that she's launching her campaign and that she's put her hand up there. So I want to say thank you so much, Zali. If you are considering putting your hand up as candidate, or if you know someone that you think would be appropriate, Henry can put that link in the chat there. And as well, of course, don't forget the pledge. Don't forget to buy your t-shirts. Don't forget to talk to everybody about it and spread the word about Voices of Goldstein. And thank you so much, Zali Steggall. It's been really, really illuminating. I found it fantastically informative and also inspiring, as I said. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much.
And to everybody else, I'll just see you down around Glen Huntly Road. Say good day when you see me. Thanks so much for your time.